Right now, we're closely monitoring this tropical wave now coming off the West African coast, and as the computer models continue to update their forecast runs, it's become they keep showing more and more indications that tropical storm development is likely as early as next week. Taking a look at the current water vapor imagery, we do see this tropical wave has plenty of moisture surrounding it, and there's another tropical wave just to the east of it that could have the possibility of developing. And we do see a decent amount of dry air just to the west of this tropical wave, and that's definitely going to be key over the next several days, how much dry air this will deal with. However, based on the latest run of the European model is now more confident that this tropical wave will develop into a tropical storm as it approaches the Caribbean. We're going to need to see if that persists over the next several days, because of course forecasting this once this approaches the Caribbean is a bit far out beyond the 5 to 7 day mark, so there's still a lot of time to iron out the forecast, but it's definitely not looking good when it comes to the amount of convective activity surrounding this tropical wave, and that could definitely prepare itself for the dry air that's ahead of it and defend the center of circulation enough for this to have a good chance of developing. As you can see, the Climate Prediction Center hasn't really changed its forecast over the past several days. It's still fairly confident that there's a possibility of tropical storm development as early as the week beginning August 16th and as late as the week ending August 29th. So we have a 2-week period where tropical cyclone development is likely at this point, and it's becoming more and more likely, like I said, as we continue to get more indications from the most reliable computer models like the GFS and the European model. Both of those two computer models just keep on persisting that at least some sort of tropical cyclone will develop potentially as early as next week. Here's the latest forecast run from the European model, and this run is definitely a lot more concerning for the Caribbean islands, because now with this first tropical wave, while initially in the prior runs the European model wasn't really confident that this tropical wave would have, at least this first one, would have a good chance of developing as it continued to head further westward, mainly due to the fact that there's plenty of dry air over the main development region. However, the European model has shifted its forecast to where this tropical wave would be able to maintain its convective activity for just long enough to have a possibility despite the amount of dry air. It expects this moisture on the southern end of this elongated envelope of moisture to moisten up the air mass that's ahead of this tropical wave, which should help defend it from the stable air that exists over the main development region. And we do see that this low pressure system is dropping, that has a millibar pressure right around 1,008 millibars, which could be considered borderline tropical storm. And another thing to point out too is that this area of moisture isn't exactly elongated area in that either, and that's not a good sign, because the more compact tropical wave is, the more likely it is to intensify, because the more compact it is, that means the energy is focused in on one area rather than multiple areas that are associated with a large envelope of moisture. And of course, with a smaller, more compact area of moisture, that means that it absorbs a lot less air surrounding it, which means that it won't be able to absorb the dry air that's just to the outside of the center of circulation, because the wind field is a lot smaller with a compact storm. So the more compact it is as it approaches the Caribbean, the more likely it is to intensify. And we do see it's borderline a tropical storm, not necessarily anything major, I'll say, for the Caribbean, but this still could bring a heavy amount of rainfall. And even if this won't necessarily be considered a tropical storm, if it were to approach you guys by next week, it'll still dump a heavy amount of rain, and it's at least something to be aware of, because that could raise a concern of flash flooding, whether this develops or not. But we do see the European model wants to take this, I'll say, by the point it reaches the Hispaniola area and the Jamaica area, to tropical storm status, where we see the pressure drop down to 1,004 millibars, which I think would be enough, especially with a circulation this small, to be considered a tropical storm at by this point, with plenty of rainfall surrounding it and a compact center of circulation. Now, of course, it becomes definitely a lot more uncertain as a storm pretty much reaches the Caribbean. It's going to be very far to the west, and the forecast hour, we're going beyond the 7-day mark, so we're definitely going to need to pay very close attention to how much stable air there will be, as well as how compact this storm will be by the time this approaches the Caribbean. But the wind shear will be relatively light for this to have a good potential, or at least the potential of developing. The key thing is the dry air, and what will determine the amount of dry air over the main development region, surprising enough, is this pressure gradient between our next tropical wave we're going to keep an eye on and this ridge. Because if this low pressure system ends up being a little bit further northward and a little bit stronger than anticipated, that should increase the northeasterly flow to bring the stable air located over Europe further southward in the main development region, and that would weaken this storm's possibility of developing with a stronger northeasterly flow that would push the stable air towards the center of circulation. However, if this next tropical wave ends up being weaker, at least initially, then that would mean the pressure gradient between this ridge and this low would be weaker, which means the northeasterly flow that would bring the stable air would be a lot weaker for this storm to have a much higher possibility of developing. Definitely going to need to pay close attention to northeasterly winds anywhere between Spain and the main development region. So definitely keep that in mind. Now, in terms of this next tropical wave, we do see the European model also potentially wants to develop this as well, where we see the millibar pressure mainly hovering around 1,008 millibars. There is quite a bit of moisture. I'll say definitely more moisture with this tropical wave than this one we're seeing right here. However, the thing is that if it were to take a track further northward, which it seems like the computer models have been leaning towards that direction, the wind shear would be a lot stronger. So I'll say that it'll have probably an equal chance of developing like this tropical wave. But even if this does develop, the good news is that at least in this case, the European model wants to take this northward, and it really wouldn't affect any land directly or even indirectly, as it'll most likely be a fish storm if it were to move this far up north this early. But still, there's still uncertainty with the trajectory forecast. We're going to need to pay close attention to the amount of ridging just to the north of this storm system. Let me show you guys 500 millibar geopotential height anomaly right now. So here's the European model's forecast when it comes to 500 millibar geopotential height anomaly, and we do see the main steering flow, at least for this first tropical wave, would be this big ridge, and there's really no area where it could escape and move out to sea. So most likely this first tropical wave will move towards the Caribbean, but it still has yet to be seen whether it'll develop into a tropical storm, whether it'll have plenty of moisture or it'll just dry up in the main development region. That still has yet to be seen. I do expect the Caribbean to at least experience some sort of rainfall from this tropical wave. I don't expect it to completely fizzle out, but the big question remains if this will develop, and that's like I said, all depends on the amount of dry air over the main development region. But current indications are showing that this could be a tropical storm once it approaches you guys, and I'll give potentially a moderate chance of tropical storm development as we approach late next week. But moving on, we do see this ridge eventually weaken, thanks to this trough we see move from the northeastern portion of the United States by early next week into the open Atlantic. This will weaken this ridge right here, and that'll create an open area to where this storm could escape. But the trajectory is definitely more uncertain beyond the 5-day mark. So definitely pay close attention to how this ridge builds. If this ridge is a little stronger, we should expect a track further southward, which would definitely be the more concerning track, because that would bring the storm towards the Caribbean and potentially could impact other areas in the more long-term future. You never know, potentially the United States. So definitely pay close attention to how this ridge builds over the next several days and how this trough moves, because the stronger the trough is, the more likely we're going to see a weakness in ridging for this storm to escape. So definitely keep that in mind as we approach the early part of next week. Just pay close attention to this trough moving through the northeast to get a good indication of where this tropical wave will go. And like I've been saying in my previous videos, I think the most likely scenario is that the wind shear will be light enough for the next few tropical waves to have a good at least a possibility of developing. The only inhibiting factor would either be the how large the tropical waves will be, how elongated the moisture will be, because of course the tropical wave needs to be a little bit more compact to have a good chance of developing a well-defined center circulation, and the amount of dry air. But the wind shear likely won't be a problem, and in fact the strong wind shear just outside of these two tropical waves would help this storm, because just outside of the center circulation, it would help the outflow in the upper levels for the air to escape in the upper levels, for more air to rise, and of course that increases the wind speed along the surface. So the strong upper level winds you're seeing just outside of the center circulation should in fact help this storm improve its outflow and possibility of developing. And we do see the light wind shear will continue even for this first tropical wave once it approaches the Caribbean, where it'll be in a small area where it could be able to avoid the strong wind shear just to the north of it. So I do believe that most likely the wind shear won't be a problem if these two storms want to intensify. In terms of what the GFS model is stating, the GFS model is at least somewhat similar to the European model. It isn't completely different like we were seeing just a couple of days ago. So that could give an indication that there might be an area of moisture that will move towards the Caribbean and at least bring an enhanced amount of moisture. I do believe that's more likely, but that's definitely likely by next week. But the big question, like I said, remains if this will develop. We do see the GFS model at least acknowledges that a more compact version of this tropical wave should exist, where we do see a small area of moisture, but still expects the dry air to be a little bit too much. But we still do see eventually an enhanced amount of moisture approaches the Caribbean. Even if this doesn't develop, you're still likely to experience heavy rainfall by late next week into the early part of the week after that, right around August 20th. So you definitely at least need to be aware of this now in the Caribbean, and a tropical storm certainly is possible for you guys. So definitely keep that in mind. But the GFS model, I have to point out, has been the less reliable model compared to the European model. And as of recently, the GFS model been leaning more and more to what the European model has been stating this entire time, which makes me believe that the GFS model is sort of playing catch up when trying to make this forecast when it comes to these next two tropical waves. So I will put a little bit more emphasis on the European model at this time, which means that a tropical storm, certainly I'll give a moderate chance of tropical storm development by next week, and potentially the week after that, as well, as the European model been persisting on the idea for quite some time. And in terms of that, the second tropical wave, we do see the GFS model is taking also a very similar scenario like the European model, where we do see the storm hover right around tropical storm status, but eventually expects the dry air to fizzle it out, and expects a track very similar to the European model as well. So I do believe the European model in this scenario at least does have some validity to it, and I do believe that a tropical wave will at least bring heavy rainfall over the Caribbean and potentially be a tropical storm once it approaches you guys. So definitely be aware of this at this point. In terms of what the European ensemble members are forecasting at this time, we do have quite a few ensemble members wanting to take a tropical storm towards the Caribbean, and we have quite a few as well that want to take another tropical storm out to sea. So I do believe that we will see a tropical wave move into the Caribbean based on all indications, potentially a tropical storm. And for the trajectory, it seems likely it'll stay, at least for this first tropical wave, it'll go towards the Caribbean. I think the ridging is just too strong for this to escape beforehand. So the Caribbean definitely needs to prepare for heavy rainfall by next week. And then for the second tropical wave, it's still a bit more uncertain how the ridging will build. It's a little bit more far out, but I'll keep you guys updated once we get more certainty. The GFS ensemble members, however, don't believe that we'll see a tropical storm approach the Caribbean at all, or even a powerful tropical wave, since the dry air would be a little bit too much for it to handle. But but the GFS model still expects an enhanced amount of moisture to enter the Caribbean by late next week, so keep that in mind. And then, but the GFS model, where it's the ensemble members are similar, is that they both want to take a tropical storm out to sea in a very similar trajectory, which makes me believe that if this continues, we're going to see this move out, the second tropical wave move out to sea. Here's what the National Hurricane Center is expecting when it comes to the potential of tropical cyclones over the next 7 days. And we do see that, at least for now, they aren't expecting a tropical cyclone within the next week. But I wouldn't be surprised if this changes as early as tomorrow, if we continue to get more indications from the European model and the GFS model that there could be a tropical storm developing in the main development region and a little bit further northward as well. I do believe the National Hurricane Center will soon change its forecast, so stay tuned to this map. In terms of my overall forecast, I do believe there's an enhanced possibility of tropical cyclone development by next week, where we do have two potential times we could see tropical storm develop. This first tropical wave, of course, could enter the Caribbean, and then this second tropical wave could move a little bit further northward. So the Caribbean, definitely pay close attention to this, as it's definitely more likely, even compared to yesterday, we're going to see a tropical storm by next week. But that's it for now, guys, and I thank you guys for watching.